and welcome to another episode of the ID Talk podcast. My name is Tony Bajonas, and I'm here with my good buddy, Mr. Alex Perala. Alex, first of all, Happy New Year,
Happy New
and
Year.
thank you, sir. How are you doing here in the year 2025?
Sick. I've been sick for
Oh,
like 2 weeks. It should be front page news, but um you won't see anything about it in the mainstream media. I've been
I
sick
didn't see it.
2 weeks,
I didn't see it in my alerts. I kept checking.
but
Uh,
otherwise I'm fine. Crawling
I'm
into
sorry.
2025.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
How are you?
You sound good, but I did know you were sick, and I feel like I kind of set you up there for a little vent. But
Yeah, I
I'm
appreciate
fine. I'm fine. I am I don't know, confused for the year ahead. Don't know what to expect. But I am also excited to be back here with you in our global headquarters and getting ready to tee up another episode of the show. And what better way to start the year than to have our good buddy Jay Meier, Senior Vice President at FaceTec, back on the show. And this was a great one. I mean, they're all great, but we finally kind of took the reins off Jay and let him get into the 2D versus 3D debate or discussion that is kind of at the meat of a lot of the stuff we've been talking about with the UR codes and just really interesting stuff, man. Like perspectives on bias and getting into photons and stuff in ways that I never really thought about. It's just a good conversation, and it's actually part one of two. So I'm excited for everybody to listen to it.
Yeah, it was great. It's always fun, I think, when we get into kind of the more technical stuff. And
Mhm.
Jay is like a um some sort of polymath with
Yeah.
his knowledge of ranging from like Wall Street to business to the physics of imaging and optics and photons and stuff. And I learned genuinely like a little more. I've been writing about FaceTec for so long and actually learning about how their 3D imaging system works in detail was it was like a little different than I pictured in my head. So I love to learn about the nuts and bolts of these things. It's a great conversation.
Yeah, agreed. So without further ado, do you want to just get right into it?
Let's get into it.
Jay, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Hey guys, as always, good to be back.
Always a pleasure.
And we just want to pick up. So last time we talked to you, we went over the UR code protocol, how it works. You kind of gave us like a step by step. And we want to focus this week a little bit more on something that we touched on last week, but we didn't really get into, and there's a lot to be said about it. And that is
Some
essentially,
technology.
yeah, why 3D is kind of necessary. I mean, you
Okay.
mentioned like the more data that you have, the higher the odds are of,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So first thing I want to do is talk about 2D systems. Okay. 99.999% of the algorithms out there are 2D algorithms that are designed to capture information from a human being, right, in one way or another. And the problem that we like to say that 2D systems are inherently flawed, and there's a couple of major flaws. Okay. And when we say flaw, we mean um, they are they intrinsically struggle with the physics of using a two-dimensional sensor and algorithms that are trying to analyze two-dimensional data, length, like a picture, length times width, right? So the remember that biometrics are a statistical calculation, right? It's never yes or no, absolutely. It's what's the likelihood that this face matches that other face? What's the likelihood that that this is a living person on the other end of the transaction? right? They're always calculations. And the thing about statistical probability calculations is that the more data that you can measure, the higher potential confidence you can have in the measurement. Okay. So that's why I always say, like, 2D captures length times width, 3D captures length times width times depth, right? So there's three factors which provides orders of magnitude more measurable data. Okay. Which means that 3D is, sort of theoretically anyway, and we think we can prove that 3D is inherently superior to 2D because it captures so much more information, and you can raise the confidence in a positive liveness comparison or match comparison a long way, right? Mm-hmm. So what's the problem with 2D systems? There's really two problems. And I don't want to say that every 2D system has problems with both of these issues, okay? But it's kind of a common theme, right? Some 2D matchers are better than others, and some of them work okay in something like the NIST FRVT tests or whatever they call it now, right? Which is basically a 2D image matched to another 2D image by someone's algorithm. And how well did it match? Were there were there any bias in there? And every single system is biased, and there's some physics behind that, right? Even 3D systems can show bias, right? But 3D systems are substantially less vulnerable to bias than 2D, and I'll explain in a second. So when a biometric system, you have a device, your phone, and it has a camera in it, right? And the camera captures two-dimensional data. Okay, it captures length. What does it produce? It produces a picture, which is length times width, right? Uh-huh. But the system is trying to interpret three-dimensionality in two-dimensional terms. Okay, in other words, a biometric system, a face matching system, has to interpret three-dimensional characteristics of a face because faces are three-dimensional, right? Mm-hmm. They're not two-dimensional like a picture, right? And so what happens is there's this thing called perspective distortions, okay? And what they are is they are the result of a two-dimensional sensor, like a camera, trying to interpret three-dimensional data. The sensor and the algorithms don't know exactly what to do with the data that doesn't quite fit. And so it puts it where it thinks it should be. And what it does, you can see it when you move your face closer to a camera or further away, the shape of the face starts to change. It appears flatter, it appears rounder, right? That's because the 2D sensor and system struggles to interpret three-dimensional data correctly. Okay.
I've noticed it particularly when taking pictures of a dog. I was dog sitting last weekend, and depending on the angle, it looks like a completely different, like it doesn't look like him if it's head on versus to the side or slightly up or slightly down. It's just because of the snout, like the recognizable features that you're like, oh, that's Indy or that's whoever.
There's a number of variables, but most, if not all of them, relate to 2D sensors' inability to correctly interpret three-dimensional data. Okay. Doesn't matter what camera you're talking about. And you can ask any photographer about this, right? If you move your face or anything closer to the camera, that has three-dimensionality, it changes the shape that you perceive in the image because it's incorrectly interpreting three-dimensional data. If it was correctly interpreting it, there would be no shift in the change of the face. Okay, it would just be maybe bigger, but the proportions would stay the same, right? The fact that the proportions of the image are different than what the actual face is because of this inability of a 2D sensor to correctly interpret three-dimensional data. Okay. So the issue is what's called the depth of field. Okay. The depth of field is the distance between the sensor and the thing it's trying to take a picture of. So in this case, your face. All right. The depth of field would be the distance between the camera and your face. And as the depth of field changes, the shape of the face changes in the image because of the perspective distortions. Okay. So when you're talking about matching faces, right? We can talk about the NIST tests, for example, and I'm not bad mouthing NIST, right? NIST's tests perform a function, right? And that function is really not to demonstrate whose is the best. The original intention of all those tests was to start benchmarking the progression of improvements of these systems over time, right? Because there was no standardized way to measure how these systems were performing, right? So it's kind of turned into a marketing gimmick. Everybody wants to say, I'm number 5 in the NIST test, or whatever. But the tests are typically a picture matched against a picture, 2D versus 2D. Okay. That's a problem because in the real world, it's a 3D versus 2D, right? Or a 3D versus, 3D, it could be, right? But in the real world that we all exist in, it's a three-dimensional face. The camera's trying to capture three-dimensional data, not a two-dimensional image that doesn't change against a two-dimensional image that doesn't change, right? The depth of field is fixed at 0 in that case because they are both, being uploaded into a computer system. There's no real change. There aren't variables. They've taken out the variable of the depth of field, and especially as it influences the shape of the face in the image because of the perspective distortions. Do you understand where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
So what this means is in the real world, your arm is however long it is. You hold the phone however inches from your face, whatever you're comfortable. Your selfie style is your selfie style, right? You might have your head down, you might have your head up, you might not really care the orientation, just as long as it opens up, right? The point is that there's 9 billion people on the planet, and their depth of field is unique to them. They're all different. Okay. That's why like passport photos and driver's license photos they try to be as standardized as possible, the distance between the face and the camera. Okay. They have you put your toes on a blue line and stand straight up and look ahead. They're trying to reduce the variability of the depth of field. Understand? So they don't have as much distortion in the images. So in the real world, they don't have that control. Everybody's doing selfies, right? They're all different distances from the face. There's lots of variability of depth of field, which means that there's lots of variability of these images in the form of perspective distortions. Okay. So, and biometric algorithm, face matching algorithm, or liveness matching algorithm is trying to make sense of all of these perspective distortions in a consistent way, but the data that they're working with is not consistent. You understand what I'm saying? So the results of their match, the confidence, effectively, the systems that are using two-dimensional algorithms are focusing and trying to do their best with unreliable data. Okay. The NIST tests are reliable data. It's always the same images at the same distance from the camera or whatever it is, right? You're matching a 2D image to a 2D image and blah, 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 blah. That's fine. Okay. And you can show how those things have gotten more accurate. But when you introduce that same algorithm into the real world and you have somebody using a camera on their phone, holding at different distances from their face, the algorithm may not be as good at interpreting the 3D data as it is in interpreting the 2D data that's in an image, right? So there's all this variability of the perspective distortions, and that is noise. That means variability of the match. Okay, if the matcher is doing the same thing with the face, against an image every single time, it is going to provide variable returns of information based on how far away the camera is from your face and how your face causes, is distorted in the image that's captured because of the distance. You understand what I'm saying? So the variable depth of field means that the image of the face is almost never the same. You could take your picture from 6 inches, you could take your pictures from 5 inches, and there's actually a difference in the way that image looks. May not be as perceptible to us because we kind of glance through it, but in algorithmic terms, there's a difference. And that means that the algorithm has to be that much better in order to compare a positive match or come up with a negative match, which means the confidence you can have in the outcome of that match goes down when compared to something else that is not vulnerable to those variables. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, but the FaceTec, your system is software meant to run, I guess, through any camera. So it's still using the same kind of camera you would get with a 2D, you would use to take a 2D image.
I
So
know.
how do you
I know.
get the 3D?
I'm getting to that. I can't wait to get to that part, right? That is the super geeky, cool stuff, right? That I still get goosebumps about. But let me go back to unreliable data. Okay. So we know that because of the varying depths of field, because people hold their cameras at different distances, right? In the real world, the 2D sensor is going to have problems interpreting 3D data, which means it's comparing two different images that aren't actually exactly alike. One is rounder when that is like a strike against, it means, this face is more round than that face. So maybe it's not him, right? So the false reject rate might go up. You understand? Right. Yeah. So how do you compensate for that? You change the false accept rate. You make it easier for the wrong picture to match, the round picture to match against the true picture. And that means you're going to ultimately let the wrong person in more often. Okay, that's the trade-off between false reject and false accept. They tune their algorithms to benefit one or the other. That's why all the tests fix the false reject rate at 1%. And then they say, well, what's your false accept rate? And if you look at the NIST tests, you'll see there's a huge change between algorithms, right? And that's because of the step that we've just gone through. So it's a statistical probability. Remember, it's capturing data. It's capturing effectively X and Y coordinate data on a two-dimensional picture, right? Then that might be the distance between the corner of your eye and the tip of your nose, for example, or the tip of your chin and the corner of your mouth, right? And all the relationships between those geographic points on your face, their relationship to each other can be represented in a mathematical formula. Okay, that's effectively what they do. They take this system that says we're going to capture all these relationships between these pieces of the face. We're going to create a mathematical number, basically a number out of it, if you want to think of it that way. And then we're going to see if the numbers are the same, right? Mm-hmm. And because they're different pictures, they can't be the same because of the variable depth of field. Is that, you understand where I'm going with that?
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So in a statistical probability, what do you do then? Do you accept a lower confidence in match? No, because that means the system is not applicable in a lot of use cases where it needs to be applicable. That's why face matching really was not used very much in the real world before AI, because AI was able to overcome a lot of variables, but it can't really overcome all of them, right? So there's still performance degradation because of the depth of field problem. So what do? It looks for more data, right? We need to raise the confidence. So that means we have to measure more stuff. Well, a lot of times what they go for, and I'm not saying every one of them, I don't have intimate knowledge of every 2D image matcher out there. So 2D image guys, just kind of bear with me for a second. Okay. Frequently what they go for is color. Besides geolocation information around your face, what else do you have? They can't use 3D, right? So they go with color, hue, saturation levels, right? Well, here's the problem with that. You'd think that's great. I mean, this guy's face is whatever color it is, and it should be this color. And now you see the Department of Homeland Security and the Maryland Test Facility putting out these new color scales, right? These are the fixed color scales that we are going to measure face matching bias against, right? And because everybody was measuring against different colors, we can now say that brown number 1, it doesn't work so well in brown number 1, but it works better than other algorithms in brown number 4, right? You understand? So they have this fixed scale that they can measure against. And then the algorithms, the developers will know what skin tones the algorithm has problems with. Okay? If you look at all the tests, there's only a couple of 2D algorithms out there that have shown acceptable levels of bias. I don't even want to say no bias. Every system, including 3D, has a little bit of bias in it. Okay, you're trying to reduce the bias to a point where it does not affect the match outcome. You understand? Right. Okay, so here's the thing about skin tone, right? Black is not a color. Black is the absence of visible light, right? If your eyes are seeing black, like the perimeter of your screen, or, my black jacket that I'm wearing right now, or whatever it is, it's not that you see a color black. It's that there's no visible light reflecting from that surface back to your eyes. So there's no information, right? Light travels in photons, right? Light frequencies, it's a photon that blows out there and is traveling, and depending on how that thing changes as it travels, it has a different color because of different frequency, right? But it's the transmission of the photons and data that tells the algorithms information about the color and the hue and the skin color saturation, right? Well, if black is not a color, in an extreme case, black provides no information back to the camera. Doesn't matter if it's your eyeball or a camera, it's the same situation, right? Provides no information. Well, it turns out that the darker the skin tone, the more visible light is absorbed by the skin, and the lower percentage of visible light reflects back to the sensor. Okay? So this is studies that also DHS has put together, and the Maryland Test Facility, I guess it's the Science and Technology Directorate, have put out some great research along these lines that show darkness of skin. The darker the skin, the more prone it is to bias, to error rates relating to color of skin, right? I mean, it's not racial bias. It's just the fact that one skin is darker. It has characteristics that reflect fewer particles of light back to the sensor. Well, it's a statistical probability calculation, right? So if everything else was constant, if every skin tone reflected the same amount of information back to the sensor, the algorithms would have the same amount of information to measure.
Right.
They don't, because dark skins reflect less light than light skins. That's where the bias comes from in these systems, okay? That's what it is. So, and they found in a huge study they did, I think it was last year, that literally the darker the skin, the more prone it was to error rates related to bias. Okay, so that's a problem. That's a huge problem.
I remember writing about that. They had a press conference. I think it was after one of those biometric technology rallies that DHS does, and they were saying, like, you
Well,
guys
it was
need
a
better.
problem. And what they did was took all the data from a half a dozen face matching tech rallies, and they used all that data to study the impact of bias. And there was just a huge amount of data and a huge amount of combinations of systems, and it was very conclusive. All right, skin
Yeah,
tone, the
and they
look,
were like, you need better cameras. That was like one of the takeaways that I remember reading.
yeah,
Which, yeah,
you need better cameras. So Apple, whoever, there's only a few people that make those decisions for the vast majority of us, right? That's nice inside a lab.
Yeah.
Oh, I can go buy $1 million camera and it might, or I can put lights in the situation that reflect more light on off of dark skin than light skin.
mhm,
Right? We brighten the light. We intentionally increase the light so that more information reflects back. At least as much information reflects back from dark skin as the lower light levels reflect from light skin.
mhm.
Right?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because you were talking about the variable of camera distance. Wouldn't the amount of available actual light in the environment where like the selfie was being taken, wouldn't that also be quite a big
Yeah,
determining factor on how much?
absolutely. It's just another factor. Yeah, the dark skin reflects fewer light particles back to the sensor. And if there is a reduced amount of light, total light available to reflect off the skin in the first place,
Mhm.
still, the proportion of light particles reflected back is still lower in dark skin. So it's like, you know, at dusk where things are kind of dark, but you can see stuff, right? But you
Mhm.
can't see dark. You can't see black. But during the
Mhm.
day, you can't see black, but you can perceive grays and you can perceive darker colors during the day. When at night, you might not be able to perceive those because there's just less light to reflect off of those surfaces. So you're absolutely right. It creates more problems. And so the system, might cause the screen to illuminate brightly, right?
Mhm.
There's other things, the problem is that they can't control for that. How
Yeah.
do you control how much light to project on a face so that you can measure how much light is reflecting back to the sensor in the
Yeah.
real world? You
Mhm.
know, that's why shading is a problem. That's, what you're talking about is like shading, right? And so outside, inside, that's another problem with putting too much, relying too much uh, on the NIST tests. I should say we're using the NIST tests data to inappropriately measure total competency of the technology, right?
Mhm.
NIST tests do exactly what they're supposed to do, and they do it very well, right? But what they do is not necessarily transferable directly to the real world, right? Or if it is, it doesn't, it's not a good transfer, right? So when somebody says, oh, we were the greatest in the NIST test for 2 years in a row, that doesn't tell you much. What you really need to know is how well, yeah, you were great in that lab, but how well did it work when, some teenager was using that algorithm in a camera in the middle of the day or at dusk or whatever, right? So that it's not disparaging NIST. That's disparaging the people that try to reinterpret the NIST results to mean something that they really don't in an effort to market their product, right?
Mhm.
But going back to the point about bias, right? 2D systems are sort of inherently struggling with three dimensionality because of the perspective distortions created from the sensor, right? It's unreliable data. So they have to look for different data to measure. And the next easiest thing is color and skin saturation, color saturation, which is also variable data and for a number of different reasons, right? So effectively what 2D systems largely do, and I'm generalizing, guys, okay, I I acknowledge that some of them work a lot better than other ones. Some of them are actually okay, in certain capacities. But we're talking about relative results to 3D right now. The 2D systems are using unreliable data, so they try and capture other data. And what many of them ultimately capture is unreliable data. Okay. So they're more vulnerable to error rates because of the variability of the perspective distortions. And they're more prone to error rates because they're trying to measure photons reflecting back to a sensor. And it's so variable between skin tones that how do you control for that, right? So the confidence in the match goes down or does not go up as high as something that is not vulnerable to those things.
That was part one of our conversation with Jay about 3D versus 2D biometrics. To hear part two, please tune in next week to the ID Talk podcast.